Hello
Hi.
and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Lidiya Yankovskaya. I am a conductor and an ambassador with Opera for Peace. I also serve as the music director of Chicago Opera Theater and the founder and the artistic director of Refugee Orchestra Project. And I am so thrilled today to be joined by these two incredible colleagues.
I'm Roderick. Hi, I'm
Yes.
Roderick.
Hello, I'm John Axelrod.
Roderick Cox is the founder of the Roderick Cox Music Initiative and was the winner of the 2018 Sir George Solti Conducting Award. Congratulations, Roderick, also on that really impressive award. And John Axelrod, who is the principal guest conductor of the City of Kyoto Symphony Orchestra and the artistic and musical director of the Real Orquestra Sinfónica de Sevilla from 2019 and 2020. So welcome to you both. It is so great to see you. Where are you coming from?
I'm in Berlin at the moment. I've been here. I live here for the past 2 years, and I have I've been here since March.
And John, where are you coming from?
Hello, everybody. I'm coming from Switzerland, and just to correct a little mistake in the information that you said, I was music director in Seville from 2014 to 19, and I am now the principal guest conductor of the City of Kyoto Symphony Orchestra. So just that everybody knows.
Great, thank you, John. Thank you for clarifying that. It's so great to see you both, and of course, this is such an unusual time for all of us and for our industry. To start, I'd just love to hear a little bit about what you've been doing during these times away from performing, and also whether it's made you reconsider at all how we view performing or how we view our approaches to our careers and our work. Roderick, do you want to kick it off?
Well, sure. I think for me, this has been an evolving situation. I have to admit it. I think it took me about 2 months or so to find a rhythm for myself, and I went through different phases of disbelief or depression, or where I just felt like I was not motivated to be in music or listen to music at all, to a point of now reflection and acceptance, and also hope, and looking forward to tomorrow and the next months, and what our my life and what our profession will look like at the end of this, and thinking about how our profession or our industry, or how music as an art form responds to the events that are happening, and making sure, thinking about me as an artist, how can I play a part in that, and what role can I play in moving our art form forward past this. It would just be, I feel it would be an unfortunate thing if we just go back to doing business as normal after something like this. And so I've been thinking about that. It seems like now, instead of music, we're doing more interviews rather than performing. So it's been interesting to actually see how we as classical musicians are connecting with one another across the world, and having conversations with people who we wouldn't normally have time to set up a dialogue with. And so I think it's yes, it has had a negative impact on us and our industry, but I think it will also, we will rebound in a more positive way, and there will be even a second renaissance of music after this. That is my hope.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about also those connections. One of the things I've loved about this moment is that as conductors, so rarely we have opportunities to talk to our conductor colleagues unless it's someone we know and we happen to be in the same city at the same time. I have connected with so many conductors during this time, and that exchange of ideas is itself so powerful. But like you, I feel that it's taken me 2 months to start looking at music again. I've been very motivated to do other things, study languages or do other kind of work that I may not have time for, but it's so difficult at a time when performance has stopped. John, what about you? How have you been doing during this time? What have you been doing?
Well, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. You might be able to hear my baby too. I think that I admire your optimism, and I am in America. I'm in Europe, where we are in a way past the curve, whereas the U.S. is struggling to find its new tempo. But at the same time, personally, I've taken this opportunity to be creative, because creativity is really at the heart of what we do. Even conducting is a creative act. And so I've been composing, and I've written a book on the business of cultural patronage. And it's my third book, actually. And I've been cooking a lot. And I've been doing other creative things to exercise my brain, not just listen and study music, which is something that we do regularly. I am, despite being in Europe, where things seem to be a little bit better. Last week I was in the IDAGIO, where the Puccini Festival takes place, and I was conducting Gianni Schicchi, albeit in masks, but that was part of the mise en scène. The director actually took the tradition of Commedia dell'arte with the masks and actually used the masks for that purpose, and it was very successful, and it worked very well, and the public seemed to appreciate it, even though it was a public with social distancing. They take very seriously the demands that are required to ensure that ourselves and our colleagues are protected. Whereas, unfortunately, at least from what we understand, what we see, what we read, there are many people in the United States who don't take seriously the necessities to ensure that we can get back to a normal life. So I take a little bit more of a radical viewpoint that things are evolving quite dramatically, and we may not actually return to normalcy, as Roderick might suggest, but that there will be opportunity from this change, and how people adapt, evolve, mutate, whatever it might be, to define a new paradigm of musical performance for the public to embrace. Because ultimately, as you know, our whole industry is just going to be chasing public, and it depends on what the public is willing to embrace. The jury is out at this moment whether the public is willing to embrace listening to performances on a computer. Most of the people that I have talked to have said, well, it's great that we can access all these things online, but it's not a substitute for live performance. And we can't actually experience live music if it's all drive-in performance, like a drive-in theater. There is an energy exchange that we as conductors feel very much as the filter of that energy. And without that live exchange and that filtration, there is a profundity that is sorely lacking and missing. I think that as we look at history, how the evolution of stage performance has taken place throughout history, we might be able to have some clues as to where we might be going in the future based on the technology that's available to us, as well as how a generational gap might make new demands on how musical performance is performed, interpreted, communicated, and distributed. And that's going to be a very interesting thing to witness. Both of you are a little bit younger than I am, so you'll probably have more time to witness all of that. But I think it's going to be an exciting adventure. And for me, I'm not sure I want to return back to normal, because normal has been faced with so many challenges and struggles to begin with for so many people. Just to return back to normal is not necessarily a good thing, except for the few who really profited from the normal. I think what is really exciting is where we're going to in the future.
Well, let's skip to speaking about this for a second. What are some of the opportunities of this moment? Because I agree with you entirely, John, that I think so many things are changing, and not just in the way we think about consuming music and in the way we think about that interaction between audience and performer, but also in the way we approach the models of the classical musical industry in general. For so long, there have been so many problems with the way our industry is structured all over the world, in the United States in particular, the problems I'm trying to tackle right now in the organizations I work with. But I think this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to wipe the slate clean. How rare it is to have that chance for everything to stop and to start over, to completely restructure everything and how we think about things. Although, unlike you, John, I do think that actually this moment will make people crave live performance more than anything ever before. To me, certainly that has been the experience. There is nothing I want more right now than to be in a room seeing people perform live, ideally a very large number of people. And for me, it would be worth some level of risk also to do that, because I feed off of that. And I think that's the case for so many people. And I think so many of us who maybe previously did not fully recognize the power of live performance as opposed to something digital now see it, even in the way we speak over Zoom. I'm sure both of you have experienced this terrible Zoom fatigue of staring at the screen, and how contrived this type of communication is also in comparison to what we do in real life. But let's talk about some of the opportunities of this moment. Roderick, you're someone who has worked extensively in the United States and you're now based in Berlin. Speak about the opportunities you see in order for us to evolve classical music.
Well, one thing I think of immediately, I believe orchestras have been forced to become much more flexible in how they bring music to their audience and their subscribers, and to let them know what they're doing during Corona. And I don't understand, I suppose, why we couldn't have done all those things, a number of those things with during the time without Corona. There's so many media rules in place that doesn't allow people, for us to lift the curtain off from up, lift the curtain from the orchestra and allow people to see behind what's going on, who's in our orchestra, getting to know the players, getting to see the musicians of the orchestra more and more. I think one thing that's always frustrated me was, when there was a time, where I thought, oh, let's put out a video sample of the orchestra here, or we need to do a video presentation. Basically, I think for us to advance in media, we're just really quite behind. I think especially in the United States, if you YouTube many of your great orchestras, it's very hard to find anything, a performance of them online. And so I think we can do more of that in the future and not live in decades of the past. People want to have access to the musicians in their community now. They want to see their musicians online. Obviously, this does not substitute at all from a live performance, but it definitely is, I think, great publicity for an orchestra. And how do you also make yourself an invaluable part of that community? People need to know who you are and that you are there. And so I would definitely love to see more of this experimentation and growth in the media and publicity sector with our orchestras going forward. Because I think in our business, we lag behind in that area. I mean, if you look at most orchestras' websites, they look like they were designed by a high school student or something. I'm sorry to say, I feel like we can be more attractive in the public relations sector. as
I think you also, oh, sorry, go ahead. I think you also say one important, you bring up one important thing, Roderick, which is now what we see in modern culture is that people want to sample something or have a deep understanding of it before they go and try it out in real life. So we all read Yelp reviews, we all read Amazon reviews of every product before we buy it. People listen to a recording artist's album before they go to that rock or pop concert. And I think the same probably is true for classical music. John, what about you? What opportunities do you see in the current moment? Sorry, Roderick, did I see you have something to add? Go ahead.
Just say, like for an example, I mean, we all conduct opera and whatnot. I mean, what if there's a way, instead of people just reading about what bel canto is versus a sort of visual or audio presentation of what happens during bel canto singing? What are some of the characteristics? What are you going to expect before you go hear a bel canto aria? I think that would just completely change the perception of opera as something, you know, something so, this is so cool, this is so athletic, this involves such agility and training and technique. It's like an opera Olympics here that these people are doing. You know, this is just not some I mean, how do they produce this sound? I know sometimes as musicians, we think, okay, you know, maybe we do our job well enough so people don't have to understand our technique and what goes on behind it. But our job as musicians, not only to convince people through music, but to convince people of our music and to talk about it and to show it and to demonstrate it. I think this is what people like. That's what people want these days.
And in opera in particular, opera is such a complicated machine. Actually, at Chicago Opera Theater, we've organized a series of conversations called Innerworkings, which brings people behind the scenes for different sectors of the industry. So people who work in the office, people who build the sets, people who design the costumes and the scenery, singers themselves. And I know I myself have learned so much even from leading these conversations, hearing someone talk about the hydraulic lift that they had to engineer together with someone at an amusement park in order to make a piece of scenery move. And it's a piece of scenery, this was during a production of Jake Hagee's Moby Dick that I conducted. And it's a piece of scenery, I recognized that it was probably a complicated thing to make it work, but I didn't really think much of the fact that this platform moved silently during an important moment in the opera and always exactly in time with whatever I did with the orchestra, but it's so complicated. John, I'd like to hand it over to you. What are some opportunities you see during this moment?
Well, let me backtrack for a moment. I think that, well, I very much appreciate everything Roderick has said. You know, I think we must be more cognizant of our cultural dynamics, because every place, every country, every culture where we perform almost has culturally specific dynamics that will have an impact on our interpretation. It might be the same Barriere de Sevilla, but depends where you're performing it. You might end up with an entirely different outcome and an entirely different interpretation. Therefore, as much as I can appreciate much of the recommendations that he's making, I think one could say that in Berlin, things are far more, shall we say, progressive and advanced than you might find in the United States, which tends to take a much more conservative approach towards classical music. Although your music theater and other young organizations in the US are certainly forward thinking. I mean, 25 years ago, I started Orchestra X in Houston. And a lot of the things that you're saying the classical music business needs to do, we were doing 25 years ago. So strong online presence. We didn't have the union restrictions to do videotaping of performances. We didn't have all these things that are prohibitions to allow the dinosaur of classical music institution to come out of its 20th century shell. I think when classical music recognizes that it actually can coexist in the 21st century and be more in service to the communities that support those organizations and those performances, then they'll have a much better way of creating those associations, identifications, and fundraising necessary to make it work. Again, culturally specific, in the United States, you depend on the tax deductions. In Berlin, it is primarily the government, or in Spain or in Italy or France or whatever, that pays for these cultural offerings. And you have billions of dollars of rescue for the cultural sector in Germany, whereas in the United States, freelancers are getting zero. So, you know, it's all a matter of cultural dynamics. I even wrote a book about it, and in German and in English, that people can read about these different cultural stereotypes and how they can impact interpretation. Now, that being said, what can be done about it? I think that entrepreneurialism has been, over the last, let's say, 20 years, a hallmark of where classical music seems to be going in terms of its outreach and its community connections. I love the idea that people are returning back to a salon environment in order to share music, even if it is in a smaller setting. The only problem with that, as we've discovered, is while it's very cool, small venues, small salons, world premieres, recitals, whatever they may be, however cool they are, they don't create a standard of living. The reason why we have institutionalized opera houses and institutionalized orchestras is because musicians have to get out of the social strata where they once were back in the days of salons and ballroom music and street performances. So I think we have to answer some questions about protection of musicians' rights. That's a very important issue that needs to be part of the discussion as we talk about what are the ongoing opportunities that we have. I think we have to talk about the infrastructure of our industry, how salaries and fees have gotten out of control in the previous paradigm, and how we might need to reevaluate the budgeting of an orchestra and its personnel and its soloists and fees. Notwithstanding the fact that, you know, we do believe we deserve to get paid for what we do, but it's a relative thing. And we know that our net income is quite different from our gross income. So I think instead of talking about what are the opportunities available for us, I think as we reevaluate the paradigms and we look at the purpose for our performances, then we can start to analyze all of those different infrastructure aspects, like union regulations, salaries, personnel, organizational infrastructure, fundraising, all these different kinds of things, how they can support the very thing that we do serve, which is the interpretation and performance of composers.
I want to go back to what you said about the purpose of our performance, because I think that's very important. You talked a lot about culture and cultural context, but to me, one of the issues that I see is that often the music or the art or the operas or the whatever it is that we see on the stage does not necessarily reflect our culture as a whole. It may only reflect a small segment of our culture, or maybe it's something reflective of a culture of old, and some of which relates to today, but some of which may not. To me, one of the most important conversations that has been happening, and in particular in American opera over the last decade, we've made huge leaps in this direction, is thinking more and more about how our industry and how the art that we make reflects our world.
That's right.
And reflects the people in our world. Exactly.
That's right.
And we still have a very long way to go. I just said that in American opera, we made strides, we have, but there's...
I think you're hitting onto something. Look at it this way. Back in the days of Haydn, what was the costume the musicians wore? They wore the outfits of the aristocracy that basically employed them for their courts or for their ballrooms or for their salons or whatever that might be. In the Romantic age, the costume changed. So did the way that the musicians, composers presented themselves. When the society started wearing white tie and tails to go out to the opera house, so too the musicians dressed in reflecting the society that they served. We can thank Wagner and a few other Liszt and a few other people for changing the rules now and instead of the artists serving the public, suddenly the public began serving the artists. And the rules changed. Suddenly the musicians went from being on the social strata of criminals and prostitutes, and suddenly they were high society. They were important to society. They didn't want to change that. I mean, think about this, Lidiya. What are the two costumes that haven't changed in 200 years? Priest and orchestra musician. Why? That Roman collar gets us closer to paradise, and the white tie symbolizes that we're part of musica celestis. We're on the right side of God in the heavenly kingdom. If we're given the opportunity to reflect our society, what are the things? I mean, Beethoven's not the problem. Beethoven could be played 250 years ago, and Beethoven could be played today celebrating that 250 years.
Although there are all kinds of musicians, John, and there are the orchestra musicians who may or may not wear white ties, but there are so many people in classical music who are still musicians, or not even in what we call classical music. Let's just say in general, there are so many people who are very serious musicians, sure, who are who make very important art, who approach it from a different direction. To me, one of the most important opportunities during this moment is an opportunity to rethink some of that model, to rethink still performing for that elite that employs us, because certainly in the United States, to some extent, that's still the model.
It doesn't just have to be contemporary music or avant-garde music or film music that an orchestra wears black shirt. You have this formality of the core repertoire that they're supposed to be in white tie and tail. It goes with the tradition. But when you have personalities like Yannick again, when you have people like Dudamel, when you have people like this that are changing the paradigm. I mean, look, I don't think it was very common for the music director of a major opera house and symphony orchestra to show on a Facebook page his photos celebrating his anniversary with his husband on the beach. That's not something that we typically would have seen even 10 years ago in the traditional frame of classical music. Kudos to Yannick that he would have the freedom and the vision to be able to say, I am who I am, and this is the 21st century, take me as I am. I am a musician available for everybody. And I think that when we reevaluate these paradigms, we look for these examples and these models. Look at Daniel Hope, this Hope at Home, how he brought, during the coronavirus, music into his living room in a professional environment, not just somebody standing behind the wall playing a Bach partita, but really putting a professional environment on his performances in the limited capacity in his home and streaming it out to the world. And as a result, he's been extremely successful. Kudos to Daniel. So I think what are the new opportunities? There's the old adage, just be yourself. Don't try to be part of an existing paradigm that no longer serves much value, especially if our audiences are aging. And if we know that we are developing a new audience, we can also develop a new paradigm to serve that audience. And there, I think we're going to find the most opportunities. Look, I've been listening to people doing drive-in performances with the cars. I've seen people doing things like Daniel Hope's Hope at Home. I see a greater purpose to serve the issues and values of the world, like your own Refugee orchestra experience, or what Dudamel did with El Sistema, or what the Orchestra for World Peace does, or what Barenboim does with the West East Divan Orchestra. I think that because of the internet and young people getting involved from a generational perspective, we have more opportunities than ever, more distribution than ever before, and more people involved with substantive causes than ever before because of the availability of information online. How do we use that? How do we make that useful for the paradigm of musical performance, that we have a purpose that actually connects with what our audiences identify with? So when you're saying, what is our purpose and how do we connect with our public? Let's learn more about our public and let's be ourselves and express that through the art forms that we make.
Yeah, go ahead, Roderick.
Missing, I think the most important point is, which goes back to the original topic, I think, is the narrative that has been placed around our art form today. And I don't think these things necessarily help us change that yet, is this idea that it is an art form that is for old dead white men, which I think we as artists know is not true, and the history of our art form that has not been the case. But I think we have to clearly think about how we shift that narrative. And I think that goes back to what you're speaking about, Lidiya. And I think during this time, we need to think very serious on how we change that perception, even though there's more distribution and more information about our art form online. It still hasn't necessarily shifted that narrative. And so how do we, what does inclusivity really mean, and how do we open ourselves up to a more globalized society? Our art form that existed in bourgeoisie Vienna or romantic Germany was very different than the globalized society where you have more blurred lines and obscured lines, and people living in cities wanting to look to that art form, but see this sort of, as Martin Luther King called, the last bastion of elitism. How do we shift that? And those are some of the things we have to definitely think about.
I think what you say is so important, Roger. Go ahead, John.
Well, Roderick, I totally agree with you. Changing that narrative is essential. And I think there are a lot of people who are working on that. It's not a question that we need to. There's a lot of people who are actually trying to do it. But again,
although I don't know that there are enough people trying to do it, and I don't know that we're working hard enough on it. Yeah,
exactly. How many benefit concerts of orchestras were done during Black Lives Matter protests, for example? I mean, I think that the point we need to really, the point we need to really challenge ourselves to realize is, again, dealing with the infrastructure. That infrastructure and institutionalization was based on what Roderick was saying, this idea that we perform for an aging white public, and the definitions of elite have shifted. I mean, I can't
although that's
imagine.
not always the case, and it's not the case with all classical music institutions, and there are some very forward-thinking institutions that get a very different audience. I think, Roderick, you were going to respond earlier.
But wait, Lidiya, before you say such a statement, give us some examples.
Well,
Let
me let Roderick respond, and then go ahead, Roderick. Yeah.
Well, when I think I think, John, you're right. There are certainly people working to bring about this change, and I just feel like perhaps it's not enough, and we all have to really come together to shift this very strongly. I think a sense of intensity or urgency around it is important. For me as an artist, I still see at some of the heights of our profession, still this elitism or pulling us in the wrong direction, becoming prevalent again. Like, for example, I just feel like, and I might, sorry to say this, but it just seems very odd that we're one of the only professions in the world that can have someone accused of sexual predatorial behavior in a very important job and taking advantage of people and investigations done, and yet we then hire them and we then put them back on stage. Like, that wouldn't happen in sports. That wouldn't happen in politics. I mean, once it's done, you lose your job. But we seem to elevate those people.
Roderick, they become elected president. Come on.
well, I think that is a unique circumstance here, and I think that's a whole nother category that we have to talk about. But I don't know if we want to, as an art form, as classical music, want to align ourselves with the political climate in our country.
And of course, I think to also just bring up the elephant in the room, other things aside. For a number of years, I have been the only female music director at any multi-million-dollar company. There are a lot of those in the United States. That should not be a problem. I think in Europe, actually, this is better. Roderick, I imagine that very often you likewise find yourself in the position of being the first to conduct in different places that you go. So I think that we still have so many things to work on. I just want to go back to what John was saying earlier also in terms of people who are doing innovative work, who are representing our world, who are both in terms of the people they work with, in terms of who's behind the scenes, and more importantly, the stories that we tell, the music that we perform. There are a number of organizations like this. I've worked a lot with Beth Morrison projects in New York City, which is a great company that presents new work. They also do the Prototype Festival. They have a very young audience. Ivan Fischer does some really interesting work in Hungary. He's got these midnight concerts that tend to have a very different audience than other concerts that they perform. And there are many smaller organizations that I think we can learn from. There's a wonderful ensemble run by a friend of mine, Ash Gordon, in Boston. The ensemble is called Castle of Our Skins. It focuses on showcasing Black composers or composers from the African diaspora who have been overlooked. And again, they have a very different audience also, because people want to see themselves on the stage, in the music, in the stories that we tell. I want to move in a slightly different but related direction, which is talking about the development of new work, because to me, that is a very important piece of the puzzle. Without supporting new artists and new creators, I think it's both goes both ways in terms of performers and creators. I don't think that we can move forward. Most of the works that we perform now, at the time that they were premiered, the stages were filled with contemporary music. At some point, we lost this. I think we're starting to make some shifts in the right direction with certain organizations in certain realms, but not others. To me, it is very important that we tell stories of and for today, along with those important classic works. But I'd love to talk to the two of you about the role of conductors in this. John, you ran the Lucerne Festival for some time, which of course is a leader in this area.
Not the Lucerne Festival, Lucerne Symphony Orchestra.
Oh, sorry, my apologies, yeah, my apologies. But I'd love to talk to both of you about our role as conductors in developing this piece. I'd love to also say, John earlier talked about quarantine being an opportunity to be creative in other ways. I think so often we forget that art and music, like any art form, is a reflection of our world. It is not a thing in and of itself. What we do is reflect the world around us. And I think especially as conductors, so often we're so busy trotting the globe and going from performance to performance and trying to cram all these scores into our heads that we don't have time to really reflect on our world, our society, or don't have enough time to connect with others. And that is so essential, because how can we represent our world if we're not living in it, if we're not thinking about all of these other things? So this is such a brilliant opportunity right now for us as musical leaders to reflect, to sit back, to think about how we can bring about change. John, go ahead.
Well, look, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I've had the pleasure to commission over 65 works and some composers, and still waiting for the world premiere of 2 pieces that I've commissioned in Sevilla, which unfortunately were rescheduled because of the coronavirus. From Jose Maria Gallardo del Rey, the great guitarist, based on Samurai Seville, and Alberto Carretero, wonderful young composer from Sevilla, who wrote an opera, one-act opera for Marisol Montalvo to create the role of La Bella Susanna, the Susanna ben Suzanne, based on the legend of Susanna ben Suzanne during the Inquisition. Both important stories about the patrimony of Sevilla, connecting to its community, and providing a new voice for this music in Sevilla, which is UNESCO's first city of music, because there are more operas in Seville than any other city on the planet, as you know. So, and you were going to conduct in Seville, so you'll know firsthand when you finally go to Seville and you do it. Look, I want to go back to the point that I made at the very beginning. It's about entrepreneurialism. With every change, there's opportunity, and necessity is the mother of invention. So people are going to think of new ways to connect and to communicate. And notwithstanding what Ivan Fischer does with Budapest Festival or Karensis did with Musica Eterna, we must keep in mind that Musica Eterna was very well financed and had a lot of freedom to be able to do the kinds of things that Karensis wanted to do without being subjected to some of the union restrictions or institutional restrictions that we face with more traditional organizations. Same with Budapest Festival. Les Siècles, Franz Xavier Roth's orchestra was able to do different kinds of things. You mentioned Boston Modern Orchestra Project. Bill Rose did this 20 years ago when I was doing Orchestra X. There are lots of people who come up with new paradigms for presentation and performance and interpretation to try to connect to a bigger audience. The problem is the size of the audience. So if we're really going to create a standard of living for musicians, for soloists, for conductors, for singers, for everybody else, it unfortunately falls within that institutional framework. And so how we change the narrative, how we change the paradigm, how we create new structures is really going to be the most important subject that we can discuss. The second thing is that we're dealing with another issue of this paradigm, which is, there's a mythology about classical music, a mythology. And that mythology is one of the things that has maintained the hold that classical music and its repertoire has been able to have on a subscription audience. If we lose that subscription audience, we're going to lose, in some respect, the opportunity to be able to offer new music, new works, new operas, new designs, new ideas. Because in the small scale, it's not going to be able to fund it on the way that we would like. Opera is still the most expensive art form that we have. So I think when you're talking about commissioning new work, there are great ideas, great voices, great composers. People are using the orchestra in new and fundamental ways, whether it's accessible, the way Gabriel Prokofiev is able to use the orchestra in a very accessible way, while still providing a unique voice, or people like Alberto Caracero, who are finding a unique voice, or Matisse Pincher, or Jake Heggie, or other great composers who are out there. New music is not the issue, and we need to continue to maintain our commitment to new music. The question is how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to be able to present it? How are we going to be able to put it on a platform that's going to be able to provide a standard of living for the people who actually.
Although there have been a number of major institutions like the Dallas Opera, for instance, which has done a large number of new work that has been extremely successful. Minnesota Opera is another example in the United States of a company that has developed new work on a very high level and successfully, and has managed to do it with a traditional institutional model. It just takes effort. We only have a few minutes left. I'd love to just, at the end of our conversation, to quickly touch on the way we can improve also communication across continents. Many of these composers that you mentioned, John, European composers, are not known in the United States. Some of them were not known to me at all, even though I spend a lot of my time in new music. There's so many American composers, like you mentioned, Jake Heggie, who are not performed nearly as widely as they should be abroad. His first opera, Dead Man Walking, is occasionally not being performed, but he has so many other great works, especially his later works, that are not being heard. Roderick, you have now spent some time in Berlin after being in the United States. What are your thoughts on how we can improve communication, and how can we make sure there is a real exchange of ideas and that we as a world unite in moving forward?
Well, just to touch on that, the point about new music before that is, I think that after the virus or during this virus, that there should be commissions being made, because we also have to think about the fact that composers aren't, I mean, the industry itself is, composers aren't working and so forth. And we're probably going to be doing things out of our library. Also, I'm looking to programming music of reconciliation or unity, like Valerie Coleman's Emoja, but also remembering that not only a premiere is not enough, but to present that music to our audience in a continuous way, because sometimes we forget that pieces like The Barbarous Ville was a disaster on its premiere, and how do we, just having one performance isn't enough. In terms of cross-cultural interaction, I think, yes, it's important for us, us conductors and artists who travel, to continuously to also be ambassadors for our own countries, to take music of our countries to other places. I think that's an important thing that we must certainly think about and incorporate in our programming.
I love what you say about ambassadorship. We're unfortunately out of time here. I wish we could continue to talk for another hour or two.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, I think let's try to do it again. Absolutely. And I want to thank you both for being here. Thank you both for being ambassadors of the United States abroad, of what is happening abroad to the United States and throughout the world. This is so important, and these conversations are so important, and may we all continue to have them even after quarantine is over. And just remember how essential
Thank you, Lidiya. Appreciate your initiative.
Thank you, Adagio, and thank you, Opera for Peace, for having us here today. Have a wonderful day.
Cheers.
Bye all.
Bye.
Cheers.